In this lecture, we'll be looking at an overview of the international scene since 1950. And when we left off in the last lecture, we were looking at the abstract expressionist painters who considered themselves to be at the end of a long line of great master painters. They dealt with big metaphysical questions, searching for new ways to address universal human experiences. Their art was meant for the white cube of the gallery, outside of the rest of society, kind of separate from society. And in fact, they saw themselves as above popular culture. They wanted to challenge the decadence and consumerism of their age. Their work was not interested in creating illusions of the outside world. They didn't even deal with political events or anything like that. They were dealing with color and trying to transcend the consumerism of their age. And so they thought that they were at the end of painting, the end of a long line of great master painters. But we know that whenever someone declares the end of something in the history of art, inevitably there is more to come. So the question we'll be asking today is, how do artists after 1950 move beyond abstract expressionism in order to make art that is connected to and not separate from the rest of life? In the 1960s and 70s, there were a number of reactions to abstract expressionism, from feminist art to land art, from conceptual art to pop art, and from performance to installation. Artists sought ways to reconnect art and life, to take art out of the white cube and into the public realm. They aimed to make art that was about life, not art that was about art. They wanted to break down boundaries between art and popular culture, between high and low art, between sculpture and painting. So we'll see how they do all of this in this lecture. They didn't necessarily return to representation, however, but they did engage life directly. So if you remember Marcel Duchamp, in this lecture we'll see how Duchamp influences artists working from the 1950s onward. Artists take the idea of the ready-made and run with it in many different directions. So he's not necessarily working representationally, but he's appropriating an object from the rest of life. So, for example, Louise Nevelson takes objects she finds and paints them all the same color and creates a composition and installation with these objects. She's not interested in what these objects were originally, but she's interested in their formal qualities mostly. She paints them in order to sort of remove their specificity, so what we see is this composition of shapes and forms. Robert Rauschenberg was inspired by the abstract expressionists, but he distinguished himself from abstract expressionism. So you see the use of blocks of color, drips, kind of referencing abstract expressionism, but he also incorporates the found object, the Duchampian found object, such as this dead bird. And he, in that sense, is working in the gap between art and life. He also uses newspaper clippings and collage, so connecting his work back to life again. But he is using these objects arbitrarily, trying to reveal that they don't contain any inherent transcendent meaning. For him, meaning is open-ended, and he's interested in chaos and unpredictability. Now, a number of artists were influenced by Jackson Pollock, another great abstract expressionist. For him, painting is like a performance, and his painting is a record of his performance. Artists take this idea of art as performance and run with it in many different directions. Pollock's paintings are these records of his gesture, of his action, of his performance. Gutai is an avant-garde artist collective that was located in Japan, and they believed that art could engage new technology to solve problems, including design problems facing our cities. The act of creation is the artwork in this case. These artists engaged in outdoor installations and theatrical events, and like Pollock, the gesture of painting here, throwing paint, is the subject of the work. But unlike Pollock, here the gesture is the art. There's no final product. The final product is the performance, and nothing is saved afterwards, unlike for Pollock, who saves his paintings that end up in museums. Alan Capro is another performance artist, and he called his art happenings. These were ephemeral, short-term pieces. They only existed for the duration of the performance. And so in that sense, he's engaging with time. And instead of an interest in the formal aspects of paint on canvas, for Capro, the whole world is the medium through which he makes art. Yves Klein is a French artist. This is called Leap into the Void, and he critiqued Pollock in a sense. His response was to orchestrate naked women dipped in blue paint as they pressed their bodies against paper. That was his reaction to Pollock in a sense. But other feminist artists had a different role for women in performance art. It allowed many women to be active agents in their performances, which challenged the traditional women or position of women in art. So if you remember, women were normally the muses, the objects of the male gaze within the painting, often nude, often there to be viewed by men. But performance allowed women to take action within the work of art. They could be the subjects of art, not for the benefit of the male gaze, but to gaze back and even to challenge that gaze with their action. So this quest to connect art and life makes its way into photography. It's a great medium for connecting back to life. Robert Frank shows a bus in the South with a very interesting composition here. He reflects the social reality by cropping the photo so that the whites are in the front and the back, blacks are in the back. And he's depicting that social reality at that time. Pop art is another form of art that is connected to life. And often it will satirize the consumeristic post-war American culture in which possessions define social status and people are living in an increasingly comfortable and wealthy culture. So Richard Hamilton, this piece is called Just What Is It That Makes Today's Homes So Different, So Appealing? He's obviously making sort of a joke about consumerism, about having sort of ideal bodies. There's sort of an erotic element. And the new temptations for Adam and Eve in today's society. Sort of this is the Adam and Eve figures, but now the temptation is for new products and for even your body to become a commodity. Andy Warhol, instead of the authenticity of the individual expression in abstract expressionism, which sort of expressed the emotion of the artist on the canvas, he's interested in using an industrial process of screen printing. And in that sense, the artist's hand is removed completely. So almost the opposite of Jackson Pollock, if you think about his paintings as an imprint of his hand. Here, the screen print removes the artist's hand. It's an industrial process. In addition, you have something like the Brillo box, also by Andy Warhol, and he's creating an exact replica of the actual product that could be found in the store. So why is this art? The same question we asked with Duchamp. And in a sense, it's simply art because the art world decided it's art. It's in the gallery, and that's what makes it art. Another pop artist is Roy Lichtenstein. He uses cartoons, but he blows them up to a large scale. The large size of the painting monumentalizes this apparently trivial cartoon. And it kind of reflects the fact that American lives have become superficial, Western life has become superficial, and we live many of our most profound moments through the media, even through a cartoon. And finally, Claes Oldenburg. He is a pop artist who takes real objects from real life and blows them up and plops them as public artworks. So again, he's transforming life and engaging life in his artwork. And oftentimes he uses mundane objects. And this one sort of has a political connotation. So turning in a different direction, Donald Judd is one of the minimalists. He's inspired by industrial materials and processes. He's not interested in self-expression. Again, that reaction against abstract expressionism. No, he doesn't want to express metaphors. He doesn't want to express his feelings. The elements of the work are the subject of the work of art. So this is a cube, that's part of its subject, and it's made of a certain kind of plate glass mirror, and that's part of its subject. His personal emotions are completely absent. Instead, you have clear, precise, polished forms. And here's another example of his polished forms. And out of minimalism comes conceptual art, and conceptual art dematerializes the art object entirely. The point of dematerializing art is to not leave any precious object behind that could be bought and sold as a commodity. So a lot of performance artists engage this way of making work. You cannot sell a performance per se. So conceptual artists are not interested in the formal properties of art, but they want to make art about ideas. Remember, for Duchamp, the idea was still inseparable from the object. But for conceptual artists, the idea can be separated from the object in many cases. So in fact, perhaps only the idea in many cases will be left. Sometimes artists would simply write instructions, and the museum buys those instructions and keeps those and can execute the art object when it wants or not. So since the idea is the most important component of the art, it can take any form as long as the idea is conveyed. So Joseph Beuys is a performance artist, and his work is based on narrative. He has this narrative in which he was nursed to health after his plane went down in World War II. He was nursed to health by natives who used fat and felt. So he incorporated fat and felt into his art, hoping to make art that would heal society after the pain inflicted by World War II. And the artist is for Beuys a shamanistic personality who brings this healing. So in this piece, it's called How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare, and it embodies this shamanistic persona, sort of also the difficulty of communication, especially in an intuitively dead age. A very famous conceptual piece by Joseph Kosuth, it's called One and Three Chairs, and it references ideas about language and our ability to communicate with one another. The chair can be represented in three different ways: through a photograph, through the real object, and through the definition of a chair. But which is the real chair? How do we experience the chair? Do we experience it physically? Do we experience it through the image? Or do we experience it as an idea expressed in words? Bruce Nauman kind of references Duchamp in this self-portrait as a fountain. So if you remember Duchamp's fountain, in this case, language is essential to his work, and the name of the piece is just as important as the performance. He is the fountain, but it's also this moment in time that only exists for an instant, and all of his art had to do with these puns and linguistic expressions. Eva Hesse is inspired by minimalism, sort of that minimalist gesture, but she's interested in moving beyond it and connecting art to personal histories and meaning. She pioneered different ways of approaching materiality, and she had a different mission for art than her male contemporaries. She experimented with new materials like fiberglass and latex, shown here, and her drawings, although they were influenced by machines, they were rather organic machines, and they didn't have function. So there's sort of an organic bent towards her minimalism. Arthur Danto is a critic who distinguishes post-minimalism from minimalism by its mirth and jokiness, unmistakable whiff of eroticism, and its non-mechanical repetition. There's a sense of the absurdity of life, a delicacy, and again, she doesn't exactly remove the artist's hand, but she makes visible the way this installation is constructed and held up. Miriam Schapiro reacted to minimalism through the use of fabric and craft. Judy Chicago is an artist, feminist, who created this piece called The Dinner Party. There are 39 individual women honored by ceramic and needlework. You can see the little example here. And then there's more names in the center of the triangle. Anna Mendieta is an artist who uses ritualistic performances and actions to connect back to the earth. And in a similar way, you have land artists like Robert Smithson. He rejects the white cube, that sort of hermetically sealed space, and he wants to bring back art into the landscape. The earth becomes his exhibition space and even his medium. This art is inseparable from the site in which it's situated. It cannot be removed, unlike a painting on a canvas. In fact, it's made out of the land, not out of paint at all. It's art of the American West, a vast kind of art that's possible in that kind of huge landscape that makes art about as big as it can be. Again, art is not a commodity because it can't be sold in this case, but there's always a commodity left over, and unfortunately or fortunately, so the photos, for example, or drawings of these pieces. And he did make work in galleries. So it's a heroic kind of masculine art that he uses machines to move the earth in the salt lake to create this spiral. And now it's slowly decaying and returning to the earth. In the 1980s, postmodernism emerged as a way of ironically playing with the rules of high art. And artists then began to question originality, again, sort of inspired by Duchamp. They asked, what is ultimate truth? What does it even mean to be authentic? We're all sort of constructed by the worlds in which we live. And so they're celebrating pluralism and arguing that perhaps even an artist is just a construct. So Gerhard Richter is interested in surfaces, and he's not stuck to one particular style. Many artists have a signature style, but Richter paints both abstractly as well as representationally, undermining that idea that one artist has only one fixed identity. Richter uses these ready-made photographic sources as his sources for representational painting. So he takes images from the media, from the newspaper. He blurs the image to emphasize the surface on which the paint is put, and rather than the depth or meaning of the image, he's interested in just the surface level of paint. These are images of images, copies asking us to question the truth of the news and how can we trust the media and or even history and stories of history. Cindy Sherman, and is another important artist in the late 70s and early 80s, she contradicts the very idea of the truthfulness of the photograph. We've discussed this a little bit, that photographs are always cropped and constructed in some way or another. Her series of untitled film stills has her as the main character in each image. So she's dressed as a different character in each image, and she represents a different type or character based on B movies, roles that you might find in B movies. So the housewife, or the woman in distress, or the teenager waiting by the phone. These are all types and sort of stereotypes, and she represents them. She is the main character of each image, representing each of these types to kind of make us question the reality of identity. Since she can be all of these different characters, perhaps there's nothing deeply true about identity. And the photograph depicts a person, but who is that person really, if she can be all these different people? Faith Ringgold is an African-American artist who quilted the stories of her life in her story quilts. Her family slept on the roof of their apartment on hot summer nights, and the challenges faced by her family are depicted in this image. The union-constructed building that her father was not allowed to work on, for example, is in the background because he's not allowed in the union. In addition, she dreamed of having an ice cream shop for her mother so she could have ice cream every night. So it's sort of a world in which things are renewed and transformed. She can see her dreams come true. Lorna Simpson considers the stereotypes against African American women, and she deals with the role of hair as an indicator of a certain race or gender or class. Again, talking about identity through photography. Another important piece that most of us will be familiar with is Maya Lin's memorial, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's different than all other memorials. Instead of a heroic sculpture of soldiers, she lets visitors literally touch their own grief by chiseling the names of the dead into the granite. So the names are chiseled into the granite, and people can walk up to them and often create rubbings of those names, or they'll trace them with their fingers or touch them. The shiny black granite is reflective, which allows for a reflection of the living community becoming reflected into the names of the dead. And this is a form of remembering. It's also constructed as a gouge in the landscape. It starts very thin and gets wide, and you walk down into it and get enveloped into this black gouge, and then you walk back out the other side and back into life and the rest of the landscape. So it's a very powerful memorial, and it's inspired by minimalism in a sense as well. So we've talked about a lot of ways that artists are connecting art and life, art to social issues, art to popular culture, art in the landscape. And artists also were connected through activism and through protest, and many artists have used art as a way to deal with political, social, and religious issues. And in the 1990s, public funding for the arts was often pulled out because politicians or public figures found particular works of art offensive. So, for example, this is a famous example. Andre Serrano photographed a crucifix in a box filled with his own urine, and he argues that he did not mean to demean the subject, but to create a very beautiful image. And he did create a beautiful image, and it reminds us of the physicality of the person of Christ, as well as bodily fluids, and certainly there would have been at least blood involved in the crucifixion. But we can debate whether or not he succeeded in being respectful or not. Felix Gonzalez Torres' partner died of AIDS, and his art installations are these poignant tributes to that painful experience. Again, very relevant in the late 80s and early 90s. He wanted to make a work of art that would disappear completely. And so he placed a stack of blue paper on the floor, and viewers could each take a piece, and one by one the pieces would disappear, like the fading body dying of AIDS. So it's a metaphor for death. So Krzysztof Wodiczko made art practical, and he aimed to connect art and life and impact the world through art, not just to talk about issues, but to actually change things. This is the Homeless Vehicle from 1988 to 1989, and it was actually distributed to homeless individuals who found them useful. Shirin Neshat deals with stereotypes of Iranian women. So Rebellious Silence, the name of this piece, shows a woman's face with Arabic calligraphy written over it and a gun bisecting her face. She looks back at the viewer, confronting our prejudices about Islamic women and violence, and she gazes back. At this time period, architecture was also undergoing change. Deconstructionist architecture, decentered architecture, it rejected the idea of a harmony or a unity or a whole, a central whole, symmetry, or even tradition in general. There's not one meaning to these buildings, but multiple references come into play. In fact, these buildings also break down the division between architecture and sculpture. Again, this idea of breaking down divisions between different media. Tony Orsler is an artist who connects sculpture and new media. He projects video onto sculptural objects, and along with animating these sculptures with his time-based media, he references pop culture with a nod to artists like Roy Lichtenstein. Yinka Shonibari has a piece here called How to Blow Up Two Heads at Once, Ladies, and it shows two female bodies shooting at each other, and the missing heads are a reference to the senselessness of colonialism. The clothing is interesting because it looks African, but the patterns here were actually invented by the Dutch to sell in Africa. So in this way, Shonibari plays with our assumptions about what is stereotypically African and is critical of the colonial legacy. Santiago Sierra is an artist who connects art and life by intervening in the lives of actual people. For the Venice Biennale, he paid 133 men of non-European heritage to dye their hair blonde. At another time, he paid women addicted to heroin the amount required for a hit of heroin in return for getting a tattoo of a straight line across each of their backs. So these performative works of art deal with exploitation, with exploitative labor, the practices of hiring people for different reasons, and economic inequality. So they're controversial because perhaps some would argue he's actually participating in exploitation himself and enhancing inequality, and in that way bolstering his own career as an artist. But this very critique is exactly the one that Sierra is going for. He wants us to ask these questions. Other artists connect art and life by serving meals in galleries, or creating installations on the streets, or literally engaging in political acts as works of art. All of these things are things that artists have done and have been doing in recent years. And finally, we have Kara Walker, who deals with stereotypes of African Americans and often uses black cutouts to create her installations, dealing with the history of slavery and segregation in this country. So in this lecture, we've seen how artists have aimed to make art that is connected to life since the 1950s, not just art that is related to other art. And hopefully by getting a taste of this, you'll be able to understand some of the myriad complex ways in which artists are making work today. And throughout this course, we've seen artists engage with the historical moments in which they live. Most of all, we've seen that art is always a product of its time and not just the vision of one individual. And oftentimes it's not about an individual's emotions. It can be about emotion, but it can also be about all kinds of other things. So hopefully this course has given you a greater appreciation of art. And hopefully as you go out into museums and other places, you'll be able to have a better understanding of art, or at least know where to start to learn about the work that you see. There's so much more to learn than you've just gotten a taste. Despite all of the images we've seen, they're just the tip of the iceberg. So hopefully your investigation has just begun.